Well, I finally reviewed each and every one of George Harrison's solo albums following the Beatles' breakup. And I've really got to say, I still believe that yin and yang is the philosophy that best applies to the journey all this music takes us on. There's ups and downs. First he puts out All Things Must Pass, world-acclaimed album, it's #1 on the charts. Years later he puts out Dark Horse, doesn't quite find the same audience, but years after that he puts out Cloud 9 and George Harrison is back on top again. Up and down, yin and yang. That's really the journey that all this music takes us on, and I feel like each album represents a time in George's life. From the beginning, I knew that Harrison's solo albums were uneven, so I was prepared for some disappointment. The best albums I'd already been listening to for years, but I did find quite a few surprises along the way. And even those I didn't enjoy, I did find some standout tracks that I've added to my playlists, some that didn't even make it on the albums. In many ways, ranking these albums really doesn't feel necessary. It might depend on the mood you're in. Maybe you're in the mood for something fast and fun like Cloud 9. Maybe you're in the mood for a more low-key listening experience. Maybe Harrison 79, but hey, you clicked on the video, you want to see a top 10 list, and that's what I'm going to give you. But rather than just list all the albums in order from best to worst, I'm going to do something a little different and show you how I came up with this ranking order, almost kind of like a tier list. If you want to know more about each one of these albums, you can watch my original reviews, including some of the live albums and collaborations. And as I said before, his first 2 experimental albums are not counted on this list either. Todd Meredith joined the series from Harrison 79 on, so I'm going to have him join me once again for this list. And I'm also going to ask him his opinions on some of the albums of the reviews that he wasn't there for. What's up, Todd?
Hey, JT. Thanks for having me back. Hope everyone out there's doing well.
Alright, well let's get started. As a reminder, I have 3 ratings for these albums. A goldfish, which means I recommend buying it on vinyl. A spotted fish, meaning I recommend giving it a listen through streaming rather than buying the whole album. And a bad fish, which means skip the album. Though there could still be essential tracks on a bad fish record, which I'll talk more about at the end. I should mention, I did give all these records another listen before filming this top 10 list, though to be honest, my opinion did not change much. So let's start with the Bad Fish records. I gave this rating to 3 albums, Extra Texture, Somewhere in England, and Gone Troppo. Obviously, these are my bottom 3 albums. I don't even own them on vinyl. But where do I place them? Well, let's look at Extra Texture again. I really don't like this album. I just find it to be draining. Outside of You, it's just one slow, morose tune after the next, which I wouldn't mind if the songs had more interesting melodies and ideas in the lyrics, but they just don't. This was actually the album I had the most disagreements over. When I had Todd listen to this, he was actually a lot less harsh about it than I was. What are your thoughts, Todd?
I like that it's a little bit different. He kind of puts the Eastern philosophy on the side burner for a little bit. It's very piano heavy. I dig the instrumental performances on it a lot, and I actually like George's voice. I think it really shines on certain tunes. Songs that I like besides You, I really enjoy The Answers in the End, as well as World of Stone, and the final track, His Name is Legs, is also a fun one. And it does get a little bit dull at times, and there's not a lot of tracks that really stand out, but I do think it's a good album to maybe fall asleep to or listen to in the background while you're doing other things.
Well, fair enough, and I do see what you mean about the performances. I just wish they had spent a little more time to bring these songs to life a little more, but George just kind of wanted to get it over with because it was his last album for the Apple label. Alright, so let's move on to Somewhere in England, which Todd and I already discussed at length. A lot of people don't like this record, and I don't blame them. More record company drama as they forced George to swap out 4 tunes, even good ones like Flying Hour, making this album a mess. But the silver lining was all those years ago, a beautiful tribute to John Lennon and one of my favorite tracks of his, which is really what saves this album from being at the bottom of the list. Not to mention a couple other guilty pleasures I actually enjoy. So congratulations, Somewhere in England, you are not the worst George Harrison album. Though don't get me wrong, it's still a bad record. But now comes Gone Troppo. This album just makes me angry. And I get it, George was fed up with the music business and just didn't care anymore, but there are some songs on this album that are just unlistenable. I still don't feel like it even has an essential track. I mean, even Extra Texture has You as a standout, and as Todd mentioned, it also feels like George and the band are really there in the studio playing. Gone Troppo sounds like it was recorded on a Casio keyboard. It's a terrible sounding record. I really don't think it's coming as a surprise to anyone that Gon Troppo is at the bottom of my list. And given George's denouncement of this record, his refusal to promote it, I don't think he would really have much of a problem with that. So Gon Troppo is at the bottom of the list, number 10, number 9 is Extra Texture, and number 8 is Somewhere in England. Alright, the worst is over, let's move on to the spotted fish category. I only really gave one spotted fish, even if a couple others were close calls, and that was Dark Horse. This album has a lot of things going against it. It contains some of George's worst vocal performances as he was suffering from laryngitis, and there's a lot of moping going on as his wife was leaving him for Eric Clapton. Sometimes this album grows on me, but on my last playthrough, it kind of fell back into my lesser albums. But the instrumental performances are really what save it. I still love the opening instrumental. I think Maya Love is a cool-ass tune, thanks to Billy Preston's really funky keyboards. I like Far East Man, although I prefer the version on Ronnie Wood's album. I wish that version was on Dark Horse. So it's definitely a middle-of-the-road album for me. But Todd was much more critical about it. Let's hear what Todd has to say.
I actually have this pretty low on my list, and the main reason is I just can't stand George's voice on this album. There are some good tracks. Harry's on Tour is a great opener, however, as an instrumental, I think it gets long and drawn out and kind of boring towards the end. I wish it was shorter, and I wish that he had written words to it. It could have been a great single. Simply Shady's pretty good, and Bye Bye Love. It's interesting, albeit pretty morose, but there's just too many tunes on here that I can't stand. So sad and ding dong ding dong. And the final track, I'm pretty over the Krishna Krishna thing at this point, and it's a pretty dull way to end the album. And then you got the single. I just think it's the most overrated of all of George's hits off of his albums. Sorry, Dark Horse, I would have actually given you a bad fish.
Since it's the only spotted fish on my list, Dark Horse comes in at number 7. Now, Brainwashed got a special rating, a Pisces fish, and that's because it's just so hard to review as an album. It's a posthumous release, it was unfinished, and even though it's got some incredible tunes on it, Marwa Blues, Stuck Inside a Cloud, there's nothing on it that really captivates me as much as his most essential singles. I still don't feel like it should be ranked, but it's gotta go somewhere, so we'll put it in the middle at number 6. Okay, now we're into the good stuff, the Goldfish records. Though I do have to say, the one album that just barely escaped getting a spotted fish was Harrison 79. And that's because it's just too mellow for me. But like Dark Horse, I do find it's growing on me. And it has another one of my favorite George singles, Blow Away, along with the equally beautiful Dark Sweet Lady. It's definitely got enough strong tracks to recommend, but it would still be one of my middle-of-the-road albums, coming in at number 5. Okay, now we're getting into the best of the collection. Although I gotta tell you, comparing these 4 albums is not easy, especially considering how different they all are. I'm actually gonna go backwards here, starting with Cloud 9. I love this album. I've been listening to it for years. I still get excited putting it on my turntable. There's just so many classic numbers. It's really well produced thanks to Jeff Lynne. Admittedly, there's a couple of hiccups along the way, but what's really nice about those tracks is that they're very well placed in the running order so that it allows for maximum listenability. Of course everyone loves Got My Mind Set on You, but I love That's What It Takes, This Is Love, When We Was Fab, Devil's Radio, the title track. I love his voice on this record, the guitar textures. Even the 80s synth stuff doesn't get in the way too much. I could make a case that this is his best record, but let's look at everything else. 33 1/3. This was my most pleasant surprise. I really love this album. I'm a huge fan of 70s funk, and these tunes are funky as hell. I mean, you got Woman Don't You Cry For Me, This Song, Crackerbox Palace, all classic tracks. And it's even got a couple of nice ballads like Beautiful Girl and Learning How to Love You. I think they're all great songs. This might actually be his most consistent album. But as much as I love 33 1/3, I don't think it's as good an album as Cloud 9. So it's not going to make the cut as George's best record. Living in the Material World, this one is vastly different from those other two, and it's one of his most personal albums, kind of like Brainwashed, where he really talks about the paradox of being a spiritual person and living the life of a rock star. As I said when I first reviewed it, it's an album that you have to be in the right mood for, but with songs like Give Me Love, The Light That Has Lighted the World, and the title track. In fact, listening to the R&B ballad Who Can See It really shows you what Extra Texture could have been. And there's just no other George Harrison album that has songs like these. Well, okay, there is, but we'll get to that in a second. My issue is that Material World gets a little bit draining in the end. I can't say it's better than Cloud 9, but is it better than 33? Ultimately, it kind of depends on what album you want to listen to when comparing them. Todd wasn't in the series yet when I reviewed these albums, so let's hear his thoughts.
Both of these are very solid, consistent albums. I really enjoy 33 and a Third. Woman Don't You Cry For Me has to be one of my favorite George tracks of all time. It's such a great groovy opener. And then the album really doesn't falter too much after that. Dear One I Can Do Without. It's another long, drawn-out tribute to one of his gurus, but luckily he picks it right back up. As for Living in the Material World, the first 7 tracks are great. Very solid songwriting. Of course, you got the amazing single, Give Me Love. My issue is with the back half of the album. There's a few songs that are lined up in a row that would all be great on their own right, but there's too many ballads in a row. It starts to get a little repetitive for me. Both are solid albums, but I actually enjoy 33 and a Third and have that a little bit higher on my list.
I definitely have no issues with that, and if you want a more upbeat, fun album, then 33 is your album to listen to. But there's one element that really needs to be discussed here. Living in the Material World had the impossible task of following All Things Must Pass. When an artist or band has a world-renowned record like that, it's so rare that they're able to live up to it. But George went in a different direction and turned out this gem. I think it was a brave choice, and there's just something about a lot of these songs, something that really hits me on an emotional level that I just honestly don't get when I listen to 33 and a Third, even though it's a great album. So put Living in the Material World in the middle there, and now we can talk about the album that everybody wants to talk about, All Things Must Pass, the iconic triple album that George Harrison made following his breakup with the Beatles. But here's the interesting thing. So when I was thinking about how I'm going to rank all these albums, I was honestly thinking, maybe Cloud 9 is the way to go. I mean, I know we all have such fond memories of All Things Must Pass. It's got the grand scale and everything. But really, maybe this well-crafted, well-produced single record is the best George Harrison album. Well, when I was re-listening to all these albums again, I placed the first disc of All Things Must Pass on my turntable. Just from the first verse of the first song, All Things Must Pass was already better than every other George Harrison album. I mean, really, think about the first 5 songs on this album. I'd Have You Anytime, My Sweet Lord, Wah Wah, Isn't It a Pity, What Is Life? I know What Is Life is the beginning of side 2, but side 1, there are Beatles albums that don't have as strong of a side 1 as All Things Must Pass. And that's not even counting my favorite song on the album, Beware of Darkness. And then there's songs that nobody ever talks about. I mean, Let It Down. Oh my god, when I was listening to the album, that song came up and I just wanted to grab the air. It's so beautiful. And since I've done my initial review, even some songs that were never my favorite, I mean, I've always liked all the songs off this album, but even stuff like Apple Scruffs or Behind That Locked Door are just I'm starting to appreciate them more. Let It Roll. I could talk forever about this album, I really could, but I really think I need to give Todd Meredith a chance to praise it, so take it away, Todd.
I think my favorite thing about All Things Must Pass is just the great variety of songs that are on it. You got the beautiful introspective ballads like Beware of Darkness and Isn't It a Pity. Then you got the fun rockers, Wah Wah and Waiting on You All. Then you got some fun acoustic, folky singer-songwriter stuff like Apple Scruffs and If Not For You. And of course, how can you forget the amazing singles, What Is Life, My Sweet Lord, and the title track. The album is a great listen, very consistent. My complaints about it were I'm not a huge fan of the production. A little bit too much reverb at times. You can't even hear what George is saying because of it. And the fact that it is a double album, it does go on a little too long. I would actually find myself in the future probably putting on albums like 33 and a Third and Cloud 9 a little bit more. But there's no debating. that All Things Must Pass isn't his best effort. He's finally getting to do his own thing. You can hear the joy and love behind the music. It really is the quintessential George Harrison album that everyone should know.
Yeah, I know, it's predictable that All Things Must Pass would top my list, but can you honestly blame me? There's a reason it tops everybody's best George Harrison albums list, even some post-Beatles albums list. It's just one of the greatest albums ever made. But I really think it's commendable that George was able to recapture some of the magic on this on a lot of his other records, even create some new magic found there. So, let's look at my top 10 list now. Number 1 is All Things Must Pass. Number 2 is Cloud 9. Number 3, Living in the Material World. Number 4, 33 1/3. Number 5, George Harrison, 1979, or Harrison 79. Number 6, Brainwashed. Number 7, Dark Horse. Number 8, Somewhere in England. Number 9, Extra Texture. And finally, number 10, Gone Tropical at the bottom. And now here's Todd Meredith with his top 10 order of George Harrison albums.
Okay, so at the bottom of the list, at number 10 we have the abysmal Gone Tropo. At number 9, Dark Horse, just basically due to the issues I had with George's vocals on that one. Number 8 we have Extra Texture, which I thought about putting before my number 7, which is Somewhere in England. I actually enjoy Extra Texture as a whole better. However, Somewhere in England does have All Those Years Ago on it, which is one of my favorite tunes and pops it above Extra Texture for me. Number 5 and 6, we have Brainwashed at number 6 and Living in the Material World at number 5. Both of these are great albums that I've really come to enjoy, but I find a little bit inconsistent and they get a little bit dull towards the middle and end of the records. Not as consistent as albums like 33 1/3 at number 4, which I find to be a really fun album. And then surprisingly, I have George Harrison's 1979 at number 3. Now I understand that I think actually 33 1/3 and Living in the Material World might be better records, but this is just personal taste for me. I love the singer-songwritery acoustic stuff on George Harrison's self-titled album, and it kind of reminds me a lot of Rubber Soul, which I had mentioned, which is one of my favorite Beatles albums. So for that reason, I have it at number 3. And then I agree with JT on my top 2. Of course, the pop masterpiece Cloud 9 is at number 2, and his amazing debut album, the double album All Things Must Pass, tops the list at number 1.
Thanks so much, Todd, and thanks for being part of the series. And once again, let me remind everybody of all the essential tracks I highlighted throughout the series. I decided to add all these essential tracks, along with a few other standouts, to a Spotify playlist. You can check it out in the link below. I think it's a solid representation of George Harrison's work. Well, that concludes the George Harrison Album Review series. And I gotta say, it was a lot of fun listening to all these albums. Even the ones I didn't enjoy as much, it was kind of fun picking them apart. And I just want to thank everybody for tuning in and commenting and supporting me. I've really got to tell you, given the quarantine that's been going on, the COVID-19 infection, it's really helped me a lot to really have this series to focus on and to have all of George's great music. You know, there's been so much pessimism and heartache and death. I mean, all things must pass, as George himself said. And sometimes it really is music that can be, you know, the thing that heals us the most, and George's music certainly does that. So thank you again. Am I going to do more of these review series? I'm not sure yet. I'll do an update video about that, but for now, comment one more time. What are your top 10 George Harrison albums? How would you list them all? Comment below. And thank you very much, everybody. I'm JT Curtis. I'll see you all next time.